Hey everybody, Dr. Dan here, and this is week 10 of History 3380 Business, Technology, and American Society. So, over the past couple of weeks, we've been talking about infrastructures and how important infrastructures were for business to thrive. So, we talked about this industrial revolution in the U.S. that's taking place after the Civil War. And in order for industrial capitalism to grow, we talked about what other systems needed to be in place. So we talked about transportation first. So we covered everything from canals to the Transcontinental Railroad. And then we talked about communication systems, and we started way back with Claude Chappé in Paris, and then Samuel Morse in the 1830s with the telegraph, and then Alexander Graham Bell, 1876 with the telephone, and then all the way into the internet. And then last week we talked about energy infrastructures, and basically we talked about coal as one of the first ones in the early 1800s, and how coal provided fuel for steam engines. And then we talked about petroleum and the first oil well in Pennsylvania, and we talked about Standard Oil and the refining of kerosene. This was before internal combustion was a thing, so we didn't use gasoline in the late 1800s, but kerosene was used a lot. And that was where we finished our energy infrastructure for last week. So this week we're going to pick up on that theme, and we're going to talk about electrification or electricity. And just to give you a real quick overview, electricity comes on the scene really in the late 1800s, and between the 1880s and let's say 1920, 1930, the country rapidly adopted electricity and really became electrified. And so really in a 50-year period, 40 to 50-year period of time, electricity went from a sort of a new mysterious thing to something that was in every home, even in rural areas. So it's really sort of a phenomenal story of technology, and it really changed the way that we use and perceive of energy. So again, sort of a little bit of a background. So Edison's first power generating plant was in Manhattan in New York City on Pearl Street, and he used DC power, which allowed electricity to be transmitted not a very long distance. That was one of the problems with DC power. But that was really the first generation station in the 1880s. And then if you look forward all the way to the 1920s, you'll find that even many rural areas were electrified. So this idea of a small grid growing bigger and bigger was taking place, and that gives you an overview of like the years when it happened. And so there's a whole bunch of other stuff, but when you do the readings this week, which again are chapter 6 and chapter 7 from my book, the points I want to get across are really the stuff you never think about when you think about electricity. And really, if you look at sort of an intellectual history, that means we're looking at how people perceived of the technology at the time. People in the U.S. and everywhere really felt that electricity was a utopian energy source because it came into your home, it was totally invisible, it had no smoke associated with it, or nothing that was perceived as environmentally consequential. And so what I propose in my book, and what you'll start to read in chapter 6, and we're sort of jumping into the middle of it, is that electricity changed the way that we perceived of energy usage, because we saw it as something that was clean at the point of consumption and was really environmentally inconsequential, because we're so far away from the generation of electricity that we forget that there's actually coal, and I have some coal here in a jar. There's actually coal that's needed to make our electricity. Now, the electricity we use today in the Midwest, about 50% of it comes from coal, and another 30% of it comes from burning natural gas, and it fluctuates all the time. And then the rest of it will come from nuclear, some hydropower, and then alternate energy sources like wind and solar. And that mix is changing all the time. But for right now, we still use a lot of coal to generate our electricity, and I don't think many of us think about it. If you look at your cell phone, right, I always ask people what runs their cell phone, and they always say the battery or electricity, but what really runs it ultimately is coal and steam. And so One of the questions this week on the quiz that you have is why is electricity different than anything that came before it, and the answer is because it's a secondary energy source. It requires a primary energy source like coal, for example, to generate electricity, and that's important to understand that there is a cost for the consumption of electricity, and I don't mean monetary, but I also mean environmental. So that's that part. And so as you go through chapter 6, you'll read a little bit about the World's Fair in 1893 in Chicago, and that was really the big debut of electricity that people began to see for the first time the possibilities of electric light and electric heat and electric appliances, and really it's the beginning of this whole electrical consumerism that we're still involved in, because the sale of everything from lamps to washers to vacuum cleaners and all the way up to modern electronics, that part of consumerism driven by electricity or by electrical devices is a big deal, but I don't have time to get into that right now, but it's there. The other thing you should know, so it's October 2019 right now when I'm recording this. There's a new movie coming out called The Current Wars, and you should go see it. I have not yet, but you'll read a little bit about the current wars in chapter 6 of my book, and it is the story of Thomas Edison versus Westinghouse and Tesla. And really the competition was between whose electrical technology was better. And Edison was a proponent of direct current or DC power. It was a lot safer. It was harder to get electrocuted, but the problem with it was it couldn't be transmitted a very long distance. And Westinghouse and Tesla were proponents of alternating current or AC power, which ultimately was adapted, and that's what we use today. And the benefit of AC power was that it could travel really long distances, and it really allowed for our electrical grids to be built out the way they are. The problem with AC power is it's easier to get electrocuted. So if you stuck a paper clip or something into an electrical outlet, that you would get a pretty bad shock. And that's the downside of AC power. It's more dangerous, and the whole story of the current wars is about Edison trying to discredit Westinghouse by proving his electrical power was too dangerous to be adopted or be used. And there were some terrible things that happened. Edison's people electrocuted an elephant. They electrocuted horses and dogs using Westinghouse's power to show that it was lethal. And that's what the current wars is all about. And there's some fascinating side stories. Edison managed to, or one of Edison's employees, managed to lobby the New York State penal system that they should invent an electric chair using Westinghouse's power, because Westinghouse's power was so dangerous it could kill a man instantly, and that actually happened. There was a trial. A guy named Kemmler, who had axe murdered his wife, went to trial, and he was the first person to be electrocuted in an electric chair by Westinghouse's power. And I won't give away any more of the story, but it's fascinating. So you'll read all about that in chapter 6. In chapter 7, you're going to read about a guy named Sam Insull, Insull, and he was a guy that actually worked for Edison early on, and he moved to Chicago, and he started to buy power plants in Chicago. And he's notable because he installed and invested in the first steam turbine system for generating electricity, which again, you probably don't know anything about it, but it's a big deal because it was a paradigm breaker from the old way that power was generated with steam piston engines. The turbine engine, or the turbine generator of Insull, allowed one generating plant to produce a huge amount of current or electricity, and that allowed for our grid to get bigger and bigger, and for power plants to be more dispersed because you need fewer of them. And it's important, and it kind of relates to question 1 on why is electricity different, because it's a secondary energy source. But question 2 on your quiz is how did society come to view electricity? And the answer is that it's a utopian energy source, and that it is modern and has no environmental consequences. And part of it was because of this turbine technology that allowed power plants to be moved out of the city And really, when they move out of the city and when we don't see them anymore, they sort of move out of our mind as well. So this idea that we can't really get our hands around climate change or global warming because we don't see all the coal that we burn, this whole attitude and narrative starts to take place in the late 1800s, early 1900s. At least that's my contention. So that's what we're going to read about this week. And as far as business is concerned, electrification just totally changed the way we do business. So in manufacturing, factories could set up anywhere now. They didn't need to be near like water power, and so it really sort of changed the way manufacturing grew. It also created a whole new business of electrical consumerism, which I touched upon. And also in retail, it allowed stores to be open at night, and it allowed people to work at night, and that was a whole new thing in the late 1800s, early 1900s. So that's why I wanted to treat electrification different than the other energy systems. So that's it for this week. Do the readings. There's the two-question mini quiz that you need to do, and that's it until next week. Everyone's doing a great job. Keep up the good work, and be safe this week. Take care. Bye-bye.